The merchant ship rolled through fog thick as wool, cutting through the North Atlantic as February ice clung to the railings like frozen prayers. March 1942. Somewhere between the hell of Dunkirk's beaches and a future nobody dared imagine, 180 British soldiers huddled in the cargo hold, their world reduced to the groan of steel and the smell of diesel and despair. When the mist finally parted at dawn, shapes emerged from the grey, piers stretching like fingers into the harbour, cranes taller than church steeples. And then, rising through the morning haze, a copper figure that made the men push toward the portholes in silence. The Statue of Liberty. Her torch caught the weak winter sun, and for a moment, the only sound was the slap of waves against the hull. Then, someone said it first, his voice breaking with something between disbelief and fear. "Bloody hell, this can't be America!" Before we go deeper into this extraordinary true story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from around the world. These forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, and you're part of keeping them alive. Lieutenant James Morrison, 26 years old, a schoolteacher's son from a village outside Manchester, tightened his grip on the metal frame of the porthole. His hands were still scarred from the evacuation boats. Behind him, boots scraped on wet steel. Somewhere in the darkness below, a man coughed blood into a rag he'd been using for 3 weeks. They'd been told stories during the crossing, not about America, but about what happened to soldiers who became burdens, shipped to the colonies, forgotten, left to rot in hospitals where nobody spoke English and nobody cared whether you lived or died. Some said the Americans were profiteers, selling weapons while Britain burned, waiting to see who'd win before picking a side. James told himself the statue was propaganda, a plaster monument erected at the docks to fool newsreel cameras before the real treatment began. But the city beyond it refused to cooperate with his fears. The skyline of New York stretched against the pale morning like iron monuments to something he'd forgotten existed. Buildings taller than anything standing in London anymore, rising from the island without apology, without bomb damage, without the gaps where neighbourhoods used to be. Ferry horns cut through the air. Somewhere, impossibly, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the docks. None of it matched the picture they'd carried of a nation still debating whether Hitler was their problem. Armed US military police waited along Pier 54, their uniforms crisp in a way British uniforms hadn't been crisp since 1940. Wooden crates lined the dock, stamped with city names that sounded like drumbeats. Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland. Place names that meant factories, steel, assembly lines that hadn't stopped for air raids because there were no air raids. The gangway dropped with a clang that made half the men flinch. "Eyes forward," muttered Sergeant Thomas Webb behind him. Webb's voice shook despite his rank. He was older, maybe 35, with a bandage around his left hand that hadn't been changed in a week. "They'll want to see if we're broken." James didn't answer. He was too busy watching. An ambulance had backed up to the pier, and women in Red Cross uniforms were unloading metal containers that steamed in the cold March air. Not soldiers, not orderlies. Women. Civilians moving among armed MPs like this was just another Wednesday morning in a country that had never heard bombers overhead. The first order came in English so clean and precise it could have come from a BBC announcer. "Form 2 lines. Wounded to the left. Walking wounded to the right." The men hesitated, waiting for the shouting, for the rough hands, for the impatience that came from dealing with broken soldiers who'd failed to stop the Germans at Dunkirk, in Greece, in Crete, in every place Britain had tried to stand and been driven back into the sea. It never came. Instead, a US Army captain, maybe 30 years old, with a face that hadn't seen combat and eyes that held something uncomfortably close to respect, repeated the order, then added in a voice that carried across the dock, "You've had a long journey. Let's get you sorted out." The words hit James like cold water. Sorted out. Not processed, not inspected. Sorted out, like they were travellers whose luggage had been misplaced, not soldiers who'd been scraped off beaches and shipped across an ocean because there was nowhere else to put them. They formed the lines. James went right, toward walking wounded, though his leg hadn't properly healed, and every step felt like broken glass grinding inside his knee. Webb stayed beside him, the bandage on his hand dark with old blood. And as they shuffled forward between rows of dock workers unloading crates and MPs standing at ease, James kept waiting for it, the contempt, the pity, the look in American eyes that said, "You couldn't hold France, you couldn't hold Greece, you ran." It never came. Instead, a Red Cross woman, her name stitched above her pocket in letters James couldn't quite read through the steam, stepped forward with a metal tray balanced in both hands. "Coffee," she said, her accent pure American, every word shaped by a confidence James had forgotten existed. "And a sandwich. Fresh this morning." Small paper cups rode the tray like offerings. Beside each cup, wrapped in wax paper, was a sandwich thick enough to be 2 meals. The first soldier hesitated, looked at the MPs, looked at the woman, then took the cup with hands that trembled from more than cold. Then another man, then another. When it reached James, the steam hit his face full on. Real coffee. Not the chicory mixture they'd been drinking since rationing began. Not the grey water that passed for tea in the field hospitals. Real coffee, black and bitter, and strong enough to taste like a promise. He took the cup. The sandwich felt heavy in his other hand. The coffee burned his tongue. The sandwich, when he unwrapped it, was ham and cheese on white bread, so soft it felt like he was eating a cloud, with butter, actual butter, thick enough to see the knife marks. Webb took his and stared at it like it might disappear. "Why?" he whispered. "Why give this to us?" James had no answer, but something cold and tight in his chest, something that had been there since the boats at Dunkirk, since the hospital ship crossing, since the moment he'd understood Britain might actually lose this war, began to crack. Past the warehouses, the city hummed with life. Car horns, voices in English that sounded nothing like English. Somewhere, a radio played Glenn Miller, the brass section cutting through the morning like an announcement that the world hadn't ended. It had just moved west, while Britain wasn't looking. Billboards advertised Coca-Cola and war bonds and movies James had never heard of. A world still at war, but untouched by the ruin James had sailed away from. An MP with a Brooklyn accent was talking to another guard near the trucks. "Hospital train leaves in an hour. They'll see the whole northeastern corridor before dinner." It sounded like a joke. It wasn't. They were loaded into trucks, olive canvas tops, engines idling smooth. James climbed in with 20 others. Webb sat across from him, still clutching the empty coffee cup like evidence. As the truck pulled away from the pier, James caught one last glimpse of the statue through the back flap. Her torch was still raised, her face was still turned toward the sea. And James Morrison, lieutenant in His Majesty's Army, schoolteacher's son, survivor of Dunkirk, felt something more dangerous than despair take root in his mind. Hope. Not hope that Britain would win. Hope that even if Britain fell, even if the Germans crossed the Channel, even if everything he'd fought for was lost somewhere across an ocean, something would survive. The truck rolled north through streets that should not exist in a world at war. And in that moment, James understood something that terrified him more than German dive bombers ever had. If Britain lost, America would finish what they'd started. Not because of treaties. Not because of Churchill's speeches, but because this country, this impossible, abundant, untouched country, would not allow Hitler to win. Not because they had to, because they could. They boarded hospital trains at Grand Central Terminal under a ceiling painted with constellations that still had all their gold leaf intact. The train was American medical transport, repurposed for Allied wounded. But the bunks were real bunks, not stretchers. The cars had heat. Actual heat. James found a spot near the window. Webb took the bunk above him, his bandaged hand hanging over the edge like a flag of surrender. The train lurched south with a whistle that sounded nothing like the air raid sirens James's ears were trained to recognise. And through the windows came a catalogue of a nation James had been told was barely involved in the war. First came Connecticut, factory towns with smokestacks running full tilt, even on a Thursday afternoon, parking lots filled with automobiles, not military vehicles but civilian cars, hundreds of them, as if gasoline was something you didn't need ration cards to buy. In Britain, private cars had been mothballed since 1940. Here, they lined the streets like evidence of a parallel universe, where war was something you read about in newspapers, not something that determined whether you ate today. Then, Pennsylvania. Rolling hills still brown from winter, small towns with intact buildings, no bomb damage, no rubble, no gaps where houses used to stand. At a railroad crossing, a group of schoolchildren stood with their teacher, and when the train passed, they waved. Not carefully, not tentatively. Wild American waves, as if a train full of wounded British soldiers was something exciting, something worth celebrating, not something shameful. Webb saw it too. He turned from his bunk, his face grey with exhaustion and something deeper. "They're waving at us," he said, "like we're heroes." "Maybe here we are," James said before he could stop himself. Webb stared at him. "We ran. At Dunkirk, at Greece, we ran." "We survived," James corrected quietly. "Maybe that's enough for them." And that was more terrifying than contempt would have been. At noon, orderlies moved through the cars handing out paper bags. "Lunch!" The bags crinkled in their hands and the smell cut through the antiseptic medical car scent. Something warm. Something sweet. "Lunch. Courtesy of the War Department," said a young medic, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles that made him look like he should still be in school. He dropped a bag on James's lap with a smile. James opened it slowly. Inside was food he hadn't seen since before the war began. Roast beef on rye bread, thick slices pink in the middle. An apple that shined like it had been polished. A slice of apple pie wrapped in wax paper that smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar, and a peacetime James had almost forgotten existed. And beneath it all, pressed against the bottom of the sack, was something else. A folded piece of paper. James almost missed it. His fingers brushed the edge, and he froze. Carefully, while Webb dozed above him and other men ate around him, he slipped it free. The handwriting was neat, feminine, American script. "Welcome to America. You are not forgotten. If you pass through Baltimore, there's a church on Preston Street that serves tea every Thursday at 3 p.m. British welcome. God save the King. MH." James stared at the note until his eyes burned. This was no accident. Someone, some American woman, with neat handwriting and access to War Department lunch distribution, had placed this message in his food. A civilian, an American civilian who knew British soldiers would be on this train, who wanted them to know they were welcome, who was willing to risk something. James didn't know what, but something, to make sure wounded men knew they could find tea and fellowship in a strange country. A kindness so specific and unnecessary, it felt like a weapon aimed directly at his ability to hate this place. He didn't show Webb. He tucked the note inside his uniform pocket and felt it there like a hot coal against his ribs. The train pushed deeper into America. Factory towns in Maryland gave way to Virginia farmland, bare fields waiting for spring, barns painted with tobacco company advertisements that looked like promises of a future where people still bought things, still planned for next year, still believed tomorrow would come. And then, at a small station somewhere past Washington, James saw them. 2 women, maybe 40, maybe 50, standing on the wooden platform, holding a hand-painted sign in red letters, thick enough to read from the moving train. "Britain stands. We stand with you." The medics saw it too. Immediately they started moving toward the windows, closing shades. their movements quick with something James couldn't name. Embarrassment, maybe. Or orders they'd been given about not letting the wounded see too much kindness, see too much hope, see too much evidence that America cared. But James had already read it. He could not unread it. Britain stands. We stand with you. Who were these people? That evening, as the train rolled through the Carolinas, turning gold under a setting sun, James hadn't watched set without worrying about blackout curtains in 2 years. Captain Richard Sullivan walked the aisle. His boots clicked on the metal floor with medical precision. He stopped at James's bunk and spoke in English that sounded like he'd learned it from movies. "Your file says you were a teacher." James looked up, careful to keep his face neutral. "History, sir. Secondary school." Sullivan nodded slowly, like a man verifying a calculation he'd already made. "We need teachers," he said simply, "for the convalescent program. Men who can keep other men's minds working while their bodies heal." Then he moved on. James sat frozen. Webb leaned down from the upper bunk, his bandaged hand dangling. "What does that mean? Teachers? In a hospital? I don't know." But something was happening, something beneath the surface. Notes in lunch bags, women with signs, a captain who knew James's profession before asking. It felt like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table, and James was only just beginning to see the edges of the picture. The second twist arrived near midnight. The car had sunk into that exhausted quiet unique to wounded men who'd learned to sleep through anything. Then, from somewhere in the forward cars, a sound drifted back through the darkness. Someone was whistling, low, almost careless, and the melody. James recognized it before his mind could catch up. "There'll Always Be an England." The song they'd sung at Dunkirk while waiting for the boats. The song the BBC played every night. The song that had become Britain's unofficial anthem of defiance. Men stirred in their bunks. Someone made a choking sound. No one dared join. Then, just barely audible over the train's rhythm, a voice spoke. American accent, calm as death. "Morrison." James jerked like he'd been shot. "Listen carefully," the voice continued, barely louder than the wheels on the tracks. "When you get to the hospital in Atlanta, there's a library. 3rd floor, British history section. Look for a book called Churchill's Wars, inside the back cover." The whistling faded forward through the train. No one appeared. No explanation came. By morning, the world had turned green and impossibly warm. Georgia landscape that shouldn't be possible in March. Trees with leaves. Grass that was actually green, not the grey-brown of British winter. Magnolia trees. James had only seen in botanical drawings, blooming white as surrender flags against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Town names painted on water towers floated past. Macon, then west, then south. The letters shrinking behind them like breadcrumbs in a story where nobody knew the ending. Atlanta appeared at the edge of the afternoon, a city that looked nothing like London, nothing like Manchester, nothing like any place James had ever been. Spread out instead of tall, green instead of grey, untouched by bombs because bombs had never reached this far, would never reach this far, could never reach this far. The hospital compound appeared outside the city, white buildings arranged in neat rows like a small town built specifically for healing. The sign posted at the entrance was almost disappointingly simple. U.S. Army Medical Center, Allied Services Wing. No barbed wire, no guard towers, just facts stamped in black paint. The trucks rolled through, and James got his first real look at what would be home or prison or something between those two words that the English language probably had a term for, but James couldn't think of it. Rows of clean white buildings stretched across landscaped grounds, a library with actual glass windows, a recreation hall with a phonograph visible through the door, tennis courts, as if wounded soldiers might recover enough to play tennis, might want to play tennis, might have a future where tennis was something that mattered. And behind it all, the smell, unmistakable, impossible, comforting, of real food cooking. Not tinned rations, not watery stew. Real food that smelled like someone cared whether you ate it or just swallowed it. They were assembled in the main courtyard. Clean gravel. A flagpole with both the American flag and the Union Jack snapping in a warm breeze that felt wrong for March. Captain Sullivan stood on a wooden platform like a man about to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. He addressed them first in English, his voice carrying across the assembled wounded. You will receive medical treatment according to the same standards as American soldiers. You will be housed, fed, and given rehabilitation until you're fit to return to duty or, if necessary, repatriated with medical discharge. You are not prisoners. You are Allied soldiers under American care. His eyes tracked across the faces, like a man counting something only he could see. Some of you will be offered work details, library assistance, teaching duties, administration. You may refuse. If you refuse, you'll remain on medical rest with no duties. But we find, his lips moved into something almost like a smile, that men who work heal faster than men who wait. His gaze caught James for a fraction of a second, just a moment, but James felt it like a spotlight. The assembly was dismissed. James walked toward his assigned building with Webb beside him, both of them silent, both trying to process what kind of war this was turning out to be. But James didn't make it to the barracks. Morrison! He turned. A young nurse, maybe 25, with lieutenant's bars and kind eyes, stood in the shadow of the library building. Captain Sullivan asked me to show you the facility. Make sure you know where things are. James glanced at Webb, who shrugged and kept walking. Then he followed the nurse across the compound, boots crunching on gravel, past guards who barely looked at him, past other wounded men who watched with hollow eyes. The library doors swung open, and James stepped into a world that smelled like Oxford. Books. Floor-to-ceiling books. Real books. Not propaganda pamphlets, not military manuals, but novels and histories and philosophy and poetry. American, British, French, German, Russian. As if someone had decided that even in war, ideas mattered, knowledge mattered, civilization mattered. Third floor is British history, the nurse said, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged space. We get a lot of men who want to read about home, helps with the healing. She smiled and left. James stood alone in the cathedral of books. Then he climbed the stairs to the third floor. The British history section was exactly where she'd said. 3 shelves of books about England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. Histories of kings and wars and empires that had risen and fallen. And there, at eye level, spine facing out, was a book titled Churchill's Wars. James pulled it free. Inside the back cover, tucked between the last page and the binding, was a folded paper. He opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was different from the lunch note. Masculine, precise, American. Lieutenant Morrison, your name came to us through channels I cannot explain. We are Americans who believe Britain's fight is humanity's fight. We have resources, we have connections. If you know of British soldiers who need help contacting family, who need supplies, who need anything we can provide without breaking military law, leave a note here. We check weekly. This is not official. This is not approved. This is simply what neighbours do. The book will always be here. RF. James's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't military. This wasn't government. This was civilians, American civilians, who'd somehow identified him specifically, who'd created a network to help British soldiers, who were willing to risk something, he still didn't know what, to make sure men far from home knew they weren't forgotten. He read the note 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the book, and returned the book to its shelf. His hands shook. Who were these people? That evening, after dinner, real chicken with vegetables that tasted like they'd been picked this week, James lay in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling. White plaster. No cracks from bomb damage. No water stains from putting out fires. Just clean white plaster that had never known war. He thought of the statue in the fog. The coffee on the docks. The sandwich so thick it felt like luxury. The woman's note about tea in Baltimore. The sign at the station. Sullivan's offer of teaching work. The whistled song in the darkness. The voice that knew his name. And now this. A library full of books and a network of Americans who wanted to help for no reason except that they believed Britain's fight mattered. He thought of London burning, of the evacuations, of the beaches at Dunkirk where they'd waited for boats that might never come, of the hospital ship crossing where men had died in the night and been buried at sea wrapped in canvas because there was nowhere else to put them. He thought of England, small and besieged and running out of everything except the will to keep fighting. And he thought of America, this vast, abundant, untouched country that could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them, could produce tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, could feed an army and still send butter in sandwiches to wounded British soldiers because they had enough for everyone. "Webb," he whispered into the darkness. "Yeah?" came the reply from the next bed. "We're going to win." "What?" "The war. We're going to win." Silence. Then, "How do you figure that?" "Because they're on our side now," James said quietly. "And they're not afraid of anything." Another long silence. Then Webb's voice, thick with something between hope and fear. "God help the Germans." Before dawn, boots thumped down the ward like a drum, pulling men from whatever dreams wounded soldiers were allowed to have. A door opened to Georgia morning, sky so wide and blue it felt like drowning in peace. A truck idled by the gate, engine purring smooth. Captain Sullivan stood beside it, clipboard in hand, counting heads as men climbed into the back for transport to a teaching detail at a local school. Morrison. He turned. Sullivan nodded once. The principal at Davis High School requested someone who could talk to students about European history. Give them context for what their fathers and brothers are fighting for overseas. Interested? James thought about the book in the library, the note inside it, the network of Americans who decided that helping Britain was worth the risk. "Yes, sir," he said. "Very interested." He climbed into the truck. Webb stayed behind, his hands still healing, his eyes still hollow with what he'd seen. As the truck rolled through the gate, James caught one last glimpse of the hospital compound, white buildings and green grass, and the two flags snapping together in the morning breeze. And James Morrison, lieutenant in His Majesty's Army, schoolteacher's son, survivor of Dunkirk, believer in nothing but survival for 2 years now, felt something shift inside him. Not just hope, purpose. Because if America had taught him anything in these strange, impossible days, it was this. The enemy wasn't always who they told you it was. The ally wasn't always the one you expected. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was believe that one small action, one note in a book, one cup of coffee on a cold dock, one sign held by strangers, mattered. It did. James Morrison taught at that school for 6 months while his leg healed. He helped dozens of British soldiers contact their families through the network. He left notes in books and received supplies that were passed through channels no one officially acknowledged. And when he was finally cleared to return to duty, he made a choice that surprised everyone who knew his story. He requested assignment to the American Liaison Unit, not to go home, to stay, to work between the two armies, to be the bridge. He never forgot that dock in New York, never forgot the coffee, or the sandwich, or the way Americans had looked at broken British soldiers and seen something worth saving. After the war, he married an American nurse he'd met in Atlanta. They settled in Virginia. He taught history for 40 years, and every year on March 12th, the anniversary of his arrival in New York, he took his students to see the Statue of Liberty. He'd stand at the base of that copper monument, and he'd tell them about the morning he'd seen it through the fog. About the moment he'd realized that America wasn't what he'd been told it was, that it was something better, something more dangerous to tyranny than any weapon ever forged. An idea. That freedom mattered. That humanity mattered. that strangers on opposite sides of an ocean could choose to care about each other for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. This is the story they don't teach you, the one that doesn't fit neatly into battles and strategies, the one that reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, people found ways to stay human. If this story reminded you that history is more complex, more beautiful, and more heartbreaking than we usually admit, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tell me if your family has stories like this. Tell me what we've forgotten that deserves to be remembered, because at WW2 Soldiers Archive, we don't just tell war stories, we tell human stories that happen to take place during war, and those are the ones that matter most. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and I'll see you in the next story.